Hello and welcome to the France 24 interview. Our guest today is Ayaan Hirsi Ali. According to New York Times columnist Nicholas Kristof, she has managed to outrage more people in more languages, in more countries, on more continents than almost any writer in the world. Hello and welcome to the France 24 interview. I'm going to try to explain why he's come to that conclusion. First of all, you had an extraordinary personal journey. You were born in Somalia, then had to flee as a child to Saudi Arabia, Ethiopia, Kenya. You were supposed to marry a relative in Canada. However, you made a stop in Europe and you decided to seek asylum in the Netherlands, which you obtained in 1992. Over there, you began to take your distances with Islam and you abandoned the faith after the 9/11 attacks. You then became an outspoken critic of Islam and began receiving death threats, especially after you were elected to parliament. The threats took a tragic turn when Theo van Gogh, a Dutch artist with whom you made a controversial movie about the submission of Muslim women, was assassinated in 2004 in Amsterdam. You then went into hiding, eventually moved to the United States after some efforts were made in the Netherlands to strip you from your Dutch citizenship and to remove your police protection. You're now a resident fellow with the conservative think tank, the American Enterprise Institute. So you're publishing here in France a new book called Nomade, which recounts your intellectual journey. And obviously, a lot of focus is on Islam. So I want to clarify one thing. For you, is the main problem now with Islam or radical Islam?
Well, the way I describe it in the book, Islam has three dimensions. There is a purely religious dimension pertaining to prayer, fasting, going to Mecca for the Hajj, etc. I don't see any problem with that dimension. The other dimension regulates the relationship between men and women, the family, the community. I would call that the social dimension, and a bit of Sharia or Islamic law creeps into it. I see that as a problem, particularly for women. And then there's the third dimension, which is political Islam, a recipe for society that has I think Sharia law is by now a word that most French people know. And I see the political dimension of Islam as a huge problem for Muslim countries themselves. Look at countries like Pakistan, look at what's going on in Egypt today. They were able to remove Hosni Mubarak, the dictator, but with the Muslim Brotherhood on the verge of coming to power, they may get a Sharia-based society like Iran or like Saudi Arabia. So it's with the political dimension of Islam, particularly, that I see a huge problem. I see also a big problem in terms of world peace, because political Islam is not only about creating Sharia at home, but it's also exporting it through jihad or holy war. And that's a huge problem. And we've been seeing that largely since 2001, but it's been going on before that for most countries in the Arab world.
What do you make of this obsession, quote unquote, with Islam that we're seeing throughout the Western world, in Europe and in France? There are debates about Islam, and there's a lot of talk about how Muslims should behave, prayers in the street, the ban on the burqa, as it's known here as the full veil. I mean, how do you explain that there's such an anxiety around Islam now?
I explain that anxiety as a problem that people, citizens in Europe and America are alarmed by political Islam. They're alarmed by suicide killings, by the bombing of innocent people, by the introduction of inhuman medieval, pre-medieval laws. That is what people are really referring to. When you look at European societies and you look at the history of the emancipation of women, and you see today that women, by choice or by coercion, are covering themselves from head to toe, taking us back hundreds of years, I think that there is an alarm in European society. This is not some faraway problem, that their governments ask them for money to give in aid to these countries, but it's something on their own streets. So it's not an obsession, it's not alarmist, it's a problem that is there, and I think that the established politicians and political parties should address it to prevent the extreme right from hijacking the subject.
But do you think people really make that nuance that you're making between political Islam, social Islam, religious Islam, or they're just, you know, putting everyone together and say the problem is actually with Islam and with Muslims?
Well, it depends on the individual. Most intellectuals here in France, I know intellectuals like Pascal Bruckner and Bernard-Henri Lévy, they make these distinctions. Finkielkraut, Glucksmann, they make these distinctions.
But the man on the street, don't you think that he's not making that distinction?
I don't know. I think you and me, we should also not generalize about the man on the street. The man on the street is an individual, and yes, there are some people who can be attracted and are attracted to parties like Le Pen's party. But most individuals in Europe, I have to say, for the last 20 years, have behaved remarkably well and have been remarkably patient. And it's really now time that the politicians they elect address this subject.
But I mean, when I read your book or your article, some of the arguments you make about Islam or about immigration are not that different from the ones made by someone like Marine Le Pen in France or Geert Wilders in the Netherlands. Of course, you know him well. What would you answer to that?
Well, I don't speak for Marine Le Pen and I don't speak for Geert Wilders, I speak for myself. And in all of my books, I continue to make that distinction. I have a problem, and I think most people who talk about Islam at all have a problem with the political dimension of Islam, with the social dimension of Islam, the subjection of women, the intolerance toward gay people, the demands made in free societies like Europe and the US to be exempted from the law that applies to everyone else so that you can subject your fellow, fathers wanting to marry off their daughters, that kind of thing, and then use a religious argument. That's what alarms people, and that's the argument I've been making consistently.
But do you think, especially here in Europe, there's maybe a kind of guilt feeling that prevents Europe from asking more from the immigrants? Do you think Europe should be asking more, or Europe should be doing more in terms of being more tolerant?
There was a gap between politicians, elected politicians, and the populations that elected them, where the populations would say, we have to demand more. People have to work, and they have to adopt our values and our laws, where the politicians would make excuses for that, make the subject taboo. And I think slowly we are emerging out of that. Leaders such as David Cameron, Angela Merkel, Sarkozy here, have all decided to move toward a policy, or at least a rhetoric, not yet policy, but a rhetoric that A, acknowledges there is a problem, and B, yes, immigrants, particularly Muslim immigrants, have to adopt our values and our cultures. There should be less and less accommodation. And the politics of accommodation, the politics of identity, the politics of multiculturalism has failed, and it has failed immigrants, particularly Muslim immigrants, the most.
You mentioned earlier in the interview Egypt and so on. Obviously, the Arab revolutions has been on the radar screen for everyone. And many people have noticed that the threat of political Islam people had warned us against is not here.
Well, we have to be, you see, these uprisings, they started just in January. We are living in May, and there are different scenarios possible. One scenario is that the bad guys stay on and cling to power. Look at Bashar al-Assad. It doesn't seem as if the international world is going to intervene anytime soon. Ahmadinejad in Iran was able to crush the 2009 Green Movement. In Egypt, the despot, the bad guy, Hosni Mubarak, is overthrown. It seems as if the secular powers in Egypt are more focused on discussing what Mubarak did wrong instead of thinking about the future. And meanwhile, the Islamists will steal the elections. They are the ones who are organized, they can campaign. So it is very, very likely sometime this year, perhaps in September, that we are going to see a new government in Egypt, and that government could be a majority Islamist government. And that I find alarming.
Well, what should be done? I mean, there was one such instance in the past in Algeria at the beginning of the 1990s. The Islamists were about to win elections, the army intervened, and we had a bloody civil war and dictatorship for 20 years. Is that the solution?
No, the solution is for the Egyptian secular people, the Egyptian liberals. I'm a liberal, so I think of the liberals and liberalism as having the best recipe for society, to awaken to the danger that they can face from the Islamists instead of focusing too much on what Mubarak did or did not do. And I think that they need a great deal of help. They need to organize, they need to form institutions, and that's going to take some time. And if the international world can help at any point, it is to help them in that appeal to ask for more time for them to organize themselves so that they can be, they can take part in this political process that is for them historic.
Right. You've lived now a couple of years in the United States. There's a lot of insistence on free speech in the United States. And there was a controversy about the burning of Quran. And I mean, until where can free speech go when it comes to religion? Can it be, I mentioned in the introduction, the movie you did about the submission of women, which was seen as very provocative. I mean, how far should we go, or should there be a limit because of the tensions around religions right now?
There should be no limit to free speech, except when people use speech to incite violence. I think, and in the United States model, that is where the limits are set. It's very wide and it's functioning very, very well. And I think when you start putting taboos take the issue of Islam in Europe, what then happens is you find marginal parties, extreme right-wing parties, for instance, who are the only ones voicing the issue, and then you drive the population away into the arms of those extreme marginal parties. I think a democracy benefits from a robust discussion and an exchange of ideas. Religion is an idea and it should be debated, and no religion should be exempted from that critical scrutiny. No religion can demand that and should be allowed to demand that.
Okay. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, thank you very much for coming on the France 24 interview, and thank you all for watching it.
You're welcome. Thank you.